Hello and welcome to this newly christened YouTube channel. Many of you have probably come here from TikTok and I really appreciate you following me here from that. This is great because I don't have any time limits here, so I can talk about whatever I want for as long as I want, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So it's just sort of laying like the groundworks of talking about books, talking about art in general. The first thing I really wanted to touch on was how I'm going to be thinking about books, and that really comes down to the idea of genre. So genre is one of those ubiquitous things that's kind of everywhere, but no one really thinks about it all that much until someone brings it up. So here are my thoughts on genres, where it came from, what it's used for, and how it could be better. So like most things, when it comes to the study of literary theory, it goes all the way back to the Greeks. At least in the West, it starts with Aristotle. And more specifically, it starts with the Poetics. The Poetics is one of the existing teachings of Aristotle that touches on literary theory, in particular the distinction between epic poetry and dramatic poetry. Now this is important because it is the first time that genre is used to distinguish between different attributes of the work itself. In the Poetics, Aristotle lays out the important parts of epic poetry and the important parts of dramatic poetry, and most importantly, the difference between the two. For example, in dramatic poetry, Aristotle is very clear that the dramatic poem needs to observe the three unities. Now, those three unities are the unity of time, the unity of place, and the unity of action. Basically what that means is that the play that you are writing needs to only have one location that it takes place in, only follow one story, and only take place in the amount of time that it takes for you to do the play. Meanwhile, epic poetry spans decades, sometimes even hundreds of years, and has tons of different plot points and threads going throughout. These distinctions are important because later more genres will explode out of the breaking of these things that Aristotle has laid out. And another thing I wanted to touch on really quickly is the differentiation between higher and lower forms of art. Aristotle was very clear that drama and tragedy were more important than comedy. And you'll find that this prejudice away from comedy has continued through to the present day. So that is the idea of where genres came from. But how are they being used today, and how have they evolved over the centuries? So over the centuries, many people would expand upon or even outright break the rules that Aristotle laid out, and this would lead to not only the furtherment of literature as an art form, but also the idea of genres overall. One of the most notable culprits of the breaking of the unities, for example, when it came to theater, was William Shakespeare and the other Elizabethan and Jacobean playwrights. For example, his play, The Winter's Tale, does not obey any of the unities. The first three acts of the play out like a standard Shakespearean tragedy. Leontes is a jealous king, thinks his wife is cheating on him when she really isn't, so he kills her. And then there's a 16-year jump in time to the final two acts of the play, which then, by the way, become a pastoral comedy. Aristotle would be rolling in his grave if he saw what Shakespeare and the others were up to. But the important thing is, by breaking these traditions, they expand the art form and expand our ideas of what is possible. Because as time goes on, social conventions change, especially social conventions around art. For example, did you ever wonder why in The Christmas Carol, The Most Wonderful Time of the Year, they talk about telling scary ghost stories? It used to be tradition to tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve instead of like Halloween. In fact, the novella The Turn of the Screw by Henry James actually takes place on Christmas Eve with someone telling the story of a turn of the screw to the assembled Christmas party. And that dovetails nicely into genres. What are they used for today? Now there's a cynical and non-cynical answer to this question. The cynical answer is that it's used for marketing. And that's it. And to a certain degree, this is kinda true. But I believe there's also a more utilitarian, benign purpose that genres can serve. But first, more about it being a marketing scheme. When you think of the name Stephen King, your mind immediately jumps to horror, right? He's called the King of Horror because his last name is so on the nose and subtlety is dead. But Stephen King has written a ton of other novels that aren't in any way associated with the horror genre. Do you know where you're more than likely to find those in a bookstore? In the horror section. You can find The Shawshank Redemption or The Green Mile right next to Carrie, The Shining, and It. Stephen King is so heavily associated with the genre of horror that even his non-horror novels will be put in there so that you're more likely to find and buy them. Now this starts to fall apart though when we encounter authors who sort of genre blend or maybe push beyond what the normal limits of genre are. For example, the author of House of Leaves, Mark Z. Danielewski, I had so many people on TikTok yell at me about how to say his name. I'm going with Danielewski because that seemed to be the consensus. Mark Z. Danielewski really only has 2 novels that can be considered horror novels, and even that's a little tenuous at best because he considers House of Leaves to be a love story, which is wild to me. His other horror is The 50-Year Sword. But because his novels push the boundaries of what is possible in fiction so much, we don't really know where to put him a lot of the time. Like Only Revolutions, I would consider that more poetry than anything. But if you're gonna find it anywhere, you're gonna find it in just literary fiction or with his other books in the horror section. And that's not even touching on the whole conundrum of young adult literature. In many instances, these young adult novels, they're not written any differently than so-called adult novels. It's just that the niche that they occupy has seemed to have grown out of some of the more traditional YA novels like Twilight, Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, and so on. So rather than allow these works to be just shelved with normal quote-unquote fiction, the gatekeepers of the publishing world have decided that it is not worthy of being called literary fiction. And there's quite a bit of stigma that comes with this. I've had tons of people commenting on my TikToks mention, oh, I would love to read adult fiction, but I don't think I read strong enough, or I don't think I'm smart enough. That's bullshit, by the way. Read whatever you want. Like, do it. And then on the other side of things, it is very common for readers of so-called literary fiction to look down on the other genres, if you will. I remember a few years back there was a bit of a dust-up because the author Hilary Mantel, who wrote Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, stuff like that, in an interview she started firing off about genre fiction like sci-fi, horror, fantasy not being real fiction, which is a little weird because she writes historical fiction, which is also considered a genre. And at the end of the day, the distinctions between genres are often kind of arbitrary. I remember there was a TikTok by Hank Green where he broke down whether or not Star Wars could be considered fantasy or sci-fi. He ended on space opera, which was kind of a cop-out for the question in my opinion, but I would put Star Wars in fantasy, which then begs the question, how do we decide which genre something goes in? A lot of the time the author will set out with a genre in mind, like they are a big fan of horror, so hey, they're writing a ghost story and it has all the correct trappings to be a ghost story, right? To go in horror. But there is a lot of crossover between horror and fantasy. What's a ghost but a spirit? And there are tons of spirits in tons of fantasy novels. Does a horror novel have to be scary? Can a fantasy novel not be scary? Where's the line? Which is why I think outside of a bookstore where they're just shelved in those genre areas so that you can find what you're looking for, I think the idea of genres is more of a hindrance than a help. It sort of narrows the thought process that the author is allowed to think within. Then, it also narrows the amount of people that are going to be marketed this book. You might only read fantasy, but then a horror comes out that would actually be your favorite book of all time, but it wasn't marketed to you so you don't know it exists. So what could replace it? Great question, thanks me, I'm glad I asked. What if I told you that the idea already sort of existed?
This is GNOD, which stands for Global Network of Discovery. Now GNOD can be used for music, products, art, but what we're going to be using it for today is literature. And as you can see, there are 2 choices that you have. Project 1, Discover, and Project 2, Literature Map. Now, Project 1, it has its uses, but really what we're going to be doing is Project 2. We go in, and then we find an author on the map. Let's go for, Mark Z. Danielewski. Nailed it. And as you can see from there, it plots Mark on the literature map with authors that it thinks you might enjoy if you enjoy him. And while you can tell this is not perfect, there are some movie directors on there. They're not authors, at least not that I'm aware of. The discoverability that GNOD offers up is truly stunning. And the best part about GNOD is the more that people use it, the more accurate it becomes. So tell your friends, gnod.com.
So there you have it, sort of a historical breakdown of genres, their use, and what I think they could be better about, and also hopefully a great new website that you can use to find your next favorite author. If you don't already, please subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, I guess. That's something that YouTubers say. Like it, send it to a friend. I'm still gonna be posting primarily on TikTok, but I'm gonna try to hit this at least once a week. We'll see what happens. I love you. Bye.